Good evening, everyone, and you're all very welcome to tonight's webinar, which is being brought to you tonight by the advisory staff here in County Mayo. My name is Brendan Garry, and I work in Teagasc Ballinrobe, and tonight for the next hour, I'm delighted to be your host for this webinar. Now, normally this time of year, we would host a number of indoor events, but due to COVID-19, we're coming to you virtually for the next few weeks as part of a series of winter webinars on a range of timely topics. So tonight we'll be keeping this webinar as informative as we can, and tonight we have two excellent speakers who will deal with a range of issues in relation to winter nutrition of beef cattle. And the first speaker tonight is Mayo native Daniel Hession, who is the Aurivo Nutritionist based in Ballhedrine, and Daniel will discuss with us silage quality and give us an overview of rations at the moment, while later my colleague Austin Callaghan, a dry stock advisor based in Teagasc and Claremorris, and Austin will discuss with us concentrate levels for the various categories of stock. While later on this evening, Vivian Silke, the Teagasc Regional Manager here in County Mayo, will put your questions to our panellists. So you, the viewers, are being encouraged to engage with our panellists here tonight through the questions and answer function at the bottom of your screens or your phones, and we'll try and answer as many of these as possible live tonight. And any unanswered questions will be followed up in the coming days afterwards. Now, this webinar is being recorded and will be available to watch back on the Teagasc Mayo YouTube channel in the coming days. So without further delay this evening, I'd like to hand it over now to Daniel, who will start sharing his presentation with us. So it's over to you now, Daniel.
Thanks, Brendan, and good evening all.
That's perfect now, Daniel, yeah.
Okay, so over the next couple of minutes, I'm going to look at what you should look for when buying concentrate feeds, some tips on buying concentrates, and as part of that, we'll take a little look at labels and what to look out for on labels, and a small bit on ingredients and what ingredients are that we want to see in large inclusions in a concentrate. A quick look at the value of straight ingredients at the moment, some cost-saving tips, and then a couple of minutes on pre-calving minerals. So as you all know, beef production, really the aim is to convert feed to an animal product as cost efficiently as possible. And feed is the single largest variable cost in beef production, and particularly during the winter period when animals are inside. So what should you look for in a concentrate feed? So when you're going to purchase concentrates, the key thing is the nutrient content. So the energy and protein being the main ones. That's really more important than the individual composition. Choose the concentrate that's right for you. So you don't need excessive protein depending on your silage quality and the type of animals you're feeding. So choose the concentrate that fits the system of the animal you're trying to feed. Energy is the most limiting nutrient, so we should always buy based on energy first and then protein. And the protein level that we look for in concentrates will depend on the animal type. So for example, weanlings will require higher protein than finishing cattle, and also that depends on the silage crude protein content. So some general points on buying concentrates. So do ask for information on the nutrient content. So that the protein content is always on the label, but do ask about the energy level within the particular nut or course ration that you're considering. As I said, purchase on the nutrient content and quality ingredients, and that really comes from looking at the label, and we're going to look at some examples of labels in a moment. Just because a concentrate has a high crude protein concentration does not necessarily mean that it's high energy. So for example, you may have a 14% protein nut that has actually higher energy than a 16%. So just bear that in mind. Do shop around, but make sure you're comparing like with like. And the typical example of that is maybe two products with a very similar name from two different mills. And you do really need to look at the label and the ingredients in that to make sure you're comparing like with like. The cheapest is not always the best value. So while it might be €5–10 a ton if you're buying in bulk or mini bulk cheaper, it could cost more in the long run if the energy value is lower, and if it's finishing cattle, for example, and it's taking you longer to finish them, or even if it's weanlings and you're not getting that level of performance that you need over winter, you'll need to make up ground with those then again when you get out to grass in spring. Don't always assume that straight ingredients are better value, particularly this year, and we'll look at the value of straight ingredients in a few moments. So if we just take a few minutes to look at labels, so there can be quite a lot of information on labels. So you're typically given the product name and the crude protein, the fiber, oils, fats, and so on, and then the breakdown of the minerals and vitamins that are included. But what's key is the composition, and ingredients must be listed in descending order of inclusion. So what that means is the ingredients up at the top, they're the ones with the highest inclusion, and down towards the bottom, then they're the ones that are the lowest level within that concentrate. So if we look at two labels here, so this is a 14%, so ignore the name and everything else, but just look at that composition. So take a minute to look. So we've barley, maize gluten, palm kernel, distillers, beet pulp, and then molasses. If we compare that then with our second label, so again, we have a 14%, so no difference in protein. If we look again at our ingredients, so we've barley and maize again, we soya hulls, palm kernel, maize distillers, beet pulp, and molasses. So if I just flick back to the first label, there's no major difference there. That the crude proteins are the same, just a slight difference in some of the ingredients. So how do we know then which one is the higher energy? So a good thing to look at, obviously, is look at the ingredients. So we've maize gluten third there, and then palm kernel, whereas here we have soya hulls and then palm kernel. So soya hulls would have lower energy than maize gluten. But if you didn't know that, another thing that you can look at is the crude fiber. So if we look at the fiber on label 1, it's 7.63, and if we compare that with label 2, it was up on 12%. So that means that although maize and barley are up at the top of the label, there's high levels of the rest of these, particularly hulls and palm kernel in there. Whereas on label 1, the crude fiber is lower. So that means there's higher levels of maize and barley. So we could see from both labels, they were both 14%. So that didn't really tell us anything. And as I said, the fiber was the key giveaway there in terms of which had the higher energy value. If we look at our UFL figure, that's a measure of energy. The higher that is, the better. So you can see label 2 has a lower energy value, and that's because the percentage of cereals, so the maize and barley within that, is lower. The reason that is, if we look at some of our typical ingredients, I know there's a lot of numbers here, but just look at the ones that are circled. So beet pulp is high in fiber, but it's still fairly high in energy. But if we go down to the likes of palm kernel, we can see it's high fiber. So that was driving that high fiber level on that second label. But we can see that the energy is lower. And again, hulls, soya hulls, high fiber, and energy is lower compared to something like barley and maize, for example. So we can classify feeds then, our ingredients, based on what they provide. And we know that they provide energy and protein, but generally speaking, they provide more of one than the other. So we can classify them then depending on what they provide more of. So if we think of protein ingredients, so soybean meal is really the Rolls Royce of protein. Rapeseed meal is another good source of protein, and peas and beans and linseed. If we focus on high energy ingredients, we want to see the likes of barley, wheat, maize and oats on the label, high up on the label. And then for fiber, so fiber is important in the diet, particularly if we're looking at finishing animals. We need some fiber in there for rumen health, or to avoid digestive upsets. Things like beet pulp, but beet pulp also has high energy. Citrus pulp, soya hulls and straw is just in there as an example. Sometimes you'll hear the word or the term byproduct used rather than fiber sources. Sometimes we associate fiber with the likes of silage or straw. So they're all byproducts. So something has been done to them, and now they're left over, if you like, and they're available for feeding. So they're generally cheaper, and they're generally higher in fiber, and we saw that a few minutes ago. So they reduce the risk of digestive upset. So they do have a part to play. The likes of beet pulp and hulls are important for that line, but the quality can be variable, and as we saw, they can be quite low in energy. So we don't want to see those too far up on the label. So if we list our ingredients then in terms of their energy, so our high energy, maize, barley, wheat and oats. Pulps, as I said, so beet pulp. Soybean meal, I did say it's high in protein, it's also high in energy. Distillers grains, peas and beans. And if we look at our low energy, the ones we really want to avoid is wheat feed and palm kernel, as we saw in our label a few moments ago. We do not want to see those high up on a label because it indicates that there's a low level of energy in that concentrate. Just want to highlight a point made earlier about the high protein. So if we look here, we have a crude protein of 17%. We have maize and barley, we have distillers. So we have similar ingredients to what we had in our earlier labels, but the UFL value is 0.92. So it's even lower than the second label a few moments ago. And again, that's indicated by our crude fiber. So there's higher protein, and that's been driven by slightly poorer quality ingredients. So it's diluting down our energy content. So that's important in terms of buying a concentrate. If you don't need that high protein, you don't purchase it. Focus on your energy. So if you are making comparisons between two different products, don't assume just because the first ingredient is a high energy ingredient that the following ingredients will also be good. So we saw maize and barley there on first and second in one of the labels, and then the third and fourth were not exceptionally good ingredients. Sometimes you get maybe maize on its own at the top, and the rest of the ingredients are not that good or high in energy. So just be mindful of that. As I said, too much emphasis on crude protein, and we saw that a moment ago that can actually be lower in terms of energy. Product names, as I said, be careful. Compare like with like, compare the labels. Don't just go on the name of the product. Make sure minerals are included. They generally are, but sometimes in the likes of a course ration, they may not be. So just be mindful of that. And is something like a buffer included or not? Again, that could be accounting for some of the difference that you're seeing in price. Look at the first 4 to 5 ingredients on a label. They're generally the most important. And as I said a few moments ago, you want to avoid seeing wheat feed or sometimes called pollard, hulls or palm kernel up in the top 4 or 5 ingredients, essentially, if you're looking for a high energy concentrate. Looking briefly then at the relative value of feeds. So if you are thinking of maybe buying some straight ingredients and you're kind of wondering like what they're valued at or how much they're worth or what you should be paying for them, we have them compared here to rolled barley, and I've rolled barley in at 320 a ton, and that's as fed, okay, so not dry matter. So 320, it has gone up quite considerably in the last couple of weeks, and depending on that might be slightly conservative, it could even be a little above that, and soybean at 425. So you can see maize is worth 341 based on that, beet pulp 325, hulls at 302, some issues with availability of hulls recently, and in some cases some issues with availability of rapeseed. So generally speaking, as someone pointed out to me the other day, no matter what you try and buy now, you're looking at a minimum of 300. If we look at the likes of fodder beets, some interest in that this year. It's valued roughly at around €66 a ton. I'm hearing kind of 65 to 70 plus transport on top of that. So it's kind of pushing it outside of being value then. And maize silage with a high starch at about 81. Again, transport is kind of pushing that out of being value at the moment. With the likes of maize silage or whole crop, if you are considering going down that route, do get a sample and get that tested to make sure that you are buying a good quality feed. Just a quick few points on home mixing. So is it an option? So generally the feed usage would need to be fairly sufficiently large to make it worthwhile. Consider the cost savings. So by the time you buy all the straights and you get, if you need to improve the facilities in the farm to store that and trying to get the ration balanced, it may not actually lead to any cost savings, particularly this year when straight ingredients are quite expensive. And if you do go down that route, you do have to be registered as a home mixer with the Department of Agriculture. So just some cost-saving tips for this winter, because we do, as you're all aware, concentrate prices have been increasing over the last couple of months. So know what you need to feed, and really that comes down to having a silage test, and I'm going to touch on that very briefly in a few minutes, and I know then Austin is going to spend a couple of minutes talking about the importance of silage as well and how that fits into diets. So get your silage tested if it hasn't been done, get it done. That will allow you to make the best use of silage. So the higher quality silage should go to the animals that require that. The likes of suckler cows in good condition can be offered lower DMD silage and allowed to lose some of that condition to save costs essentially over the winter. Buy in bulk rather than bags. If you haven't a large bin in place, maybe consider one of the smaller black bins and allow you to get a smaller bulk amount. It will lead to a saving. Keep rations simple, so you don't need fancy kind of bells and whistles, if you like, buffers, very high spec minerals. If there's no real need for them, why pay for them? You don't need them. Keep rations simple. Look at a course rather than a nut. They're cheaper because obviously there's a cost associated with making that nut or that pellet. Do price around, but as I said, make sure you're comparing like with like. If you're finishing cattle, restrict that finishing period. So don't have it extended on excessively long. The efficiency is reduced and your costs are increasing the whole time. And once cattle are fit for slaughter, sell them. Don't hold them out for an extra week or two, because at that stage they're putting on fat. Most likely you could be penalized for that. They could be going overweight. So you have a loss there, plus you've fed for a week to 2 weeks longer than you actually needed to. Just briefly on silage, if we look at the averages for the samples received into the feed and forage lab in the mill in Ballahadreen over the last couple of years, we can see that the 5-year average for DMD is 69%, which is reasonably okay, but again, depends on, so if that was for finishing cattle, there's quite a lot of concentrates to go in there. If that was for weanlings, we'd be looking really ideally for that to be up at 72 or 73. But for suckler cows in good condition, that will be ideal for a time. This season so far, we can see the dry matter slightly higher. That's probably related to some of the good conditions we had when silage making was ongoing. And again, the DMD somewhere in and around normal. If we look at last year in particular, I just want to look at the crude protein there. So the average was 13.5. That's reasonably good because we are seeing nationally crude protein starting to decline in recent years. And we can see that sometimes the average hides a lot. So we can see that the max DMD was over 80, which is exceptionally good silage. Finally then, on to pre-calver minerals. So they should be fed for about 4 to 6 weeks pre-calving, and generally they're formulated to be based on 120 grams per cow per day feeding rate. But do check the bag minerals if it's bag minerals you're feeding, because some of them are at slightly higher. So maybe some are at 100, some are at 150. So just check that to make sure that the cow is getting the right level of minerals every day. There's a number of ways of getting the minerals into the cows, including buckets through the water, boluses. The most common one and probably fail-safe is top dressing on silage. That should be done twice a day. So split it 60 grams in the morning, 60 grams in the evening, and do weigh out that. So make sure it is actually 120 grams and not maybe 70 or 80 grams that the cow is getting. Ensure that there's adequate feed space. So that's important. And that's one of the reasons that we split it, to give the cow every chance to get her full allowance for the day. If you have minerals left over from last year, probably best not to totally rely on them. Check the date in them, that they're probably past their use by date, and there can be issues with using last year's minerals. Finally, just to highlight some services from us at Nutrius and things that we can help you with. So as I mentioned there, forage quality analysis, so silage analysis, so quite a lot of samples at the moment coming through the lab. So if it's something that you want to get done, pop into one of the Homeland stores, contact your local farm commercial specialist, or even give me a call in the mill and we can get that sorted for you. Forage mineral analysis is also available, bit out of season now, but pre-insolubility. So testing your sugars and your nitrates, and I know Teagasc can do that as well in your local office, and that's important as well. Or total diet formulation for total diet plans. So that's all from me. Thank you, and any questions, more than happy to answer them.
Thanks very much, Daniel, there for that brilliant overview and presentation on ingredients and state of play as regards rations. I'm now going to get you just to stop sharing your screen there, Daniel, now for a minute. And I'm now going to ask my colleague Austin Callaghan there to start presenting his presentation. And indeed, look at lots of questions are coming in there at this moment in time. So look at keep the questions coming, and we will pick them up shortly when Austin's presentation is over, and Vivian Silke then will put your questions to our panelists. So keep them coming, and you can keep typing them in there in the Q&A tab there at the bottom of your screens. So it's over to you now, Austin.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's webinar. All right, so again, I'm going to cover probably a small bit of silage and weight gain. All right, so weight gains, weights of stock, what maybe target weights are. Just look at silage, grass, feed energy values, so farmers kind of have a good understanding of that. Supplementation levels and other considerations with finishing of stock. All right, and other winter management issues. So obviously, Teagasc, we recognise, and I'm sure lots of farmers recognise on the call here, that maybe stock don't perform very well over the winter. Some stock don't perform well over the winter. And obviously, the big reason for this poor performance is probably poor quality silage. Would be one of the main reasons. There will be other reasons as well, but poor quality feed. Winter housing is very expensive, and I don't think you need me to tell you that at this stage. And farmers seem to be recognising this more and more, that housing of cattle over the winter months is expensive. And in that situation where cattle aren't performing, like, it's actually more expensive because you're paying for non-performance. All right. So silage costs in a total lifetime in a sucker to beef or dairy calf to beef system, they're probably 30 to 40% of your total feed of your costs. All right. In a kind of system, maybe suckler to wean, and that could be higher again. All right. And cattle tend to be housed in this part of the world probably for 4 to 5 months. On poorer lands, this could be higher or longer. And if poor weather conditions, poor springs, poor autumns, again, this could be higher. And cattle should continue to gain and grow over that period. All right. While cattle are at grass, they should be gaining probably on average. Farmers just kind of have these figures in their head, maybe 30 kilograms per month. This would be kind of your yearlings, whatever. They should be gaining 30 kilograms per month. They probably do a bit more than that in the spring, probably 40 in the early spring. As grass quality declines going into the autumn, that probably comes back towards 20 kilos. And depending on your management, you'll probably be able to keep that up higher in the autumn as well. And obviously on the farm, you tend to rotate your cattle through paddocks, fields. You're conscious of keeping the grass quality good in front of the stock, all right, so they perform well. Some farmers fall down on keeping silage quality good enough, all right. So I said a house for 4 to 5 months, cattle growth rates are reduced because basically they're on a silage diet, and some of these silages aren't outstanding quality. Again, your target, probably your stock should gain 15 to 20 kilos per month over the winter months. Now that's if you're putting them back to grass. If you're selling maybe yearlings, whatever, they probably should be gaining a bit more than this. If you're selling from the shed, whatever, they probably should be gaining a bit more than this. But target for stock going back to grass, about 0.5 kilogram per day, 2.6 of a kilogram per day. Fairly simple, 15 to 20 kilograms per month. And again, what we're finding and what we're seeing on a lot of farms, this could be 0 to 10 kgs per month, right? So after farmers going to the huge expense of making silage, fertilizer and everything, and you look at your costs on your farm, a huge amount of them revolve around the wintering of cattle on your farm. And in a situation then where you put the stock in for 4 months, 5 months, and they perform 0 to 10 kgs per month, well, you don't need me to tell you that isn't very profitable, all right? So silage in general obviously has a reduced feeding value, obviously, it's, as opposed to our grass. It's cut kind of a stronger, it's growing longer, but it has a reduced feed value. If you manage the silage properly, or if you manage your silage making process properly, you can increase the energy content of this. And so why your stock weights declines? So it's on a silage only diet with no supplementation, and target weights are not achieved in this situation. Okay. So just give you an example where farmers should be aware of this. I'm sure lots of you are aware of this. What stock should gain? So weaning should probably at weaning be approaching 300 kilograms. All right. And your housing gains probably then should be 80 kilograms. 4 months, 5 months, probably a bit more than that. If you're housing for 5 months, your gain should be at least 80 kilograms. And like I say, we're going to be looking at situations where it's half this or below that on a lot of farms. Or your yearling stock dinner at grass for 7 to 8 months, your target gain is another 200 kilograms, all right? So that's 3 and 2 is 500, probably coming into the autumn. Now this will probably be a steer, a sucked cross steer, 550, 600 kilos, you probably want to be targeting. How many stock are reaching that at 18 to 18 months? Probably not a lot, all right? A dairy calf to beef, just give you the figures there, obviously they are lower again, but again, the targets need to be reached, all right? And to get this, you need good grassland management to reach these targets and need to produce quality silage, all right? And quality silage is also very important, and I think we do tend to forget it with regard to suckler cows, and maybe some farmers think that suckler cows can take poor quality silage and maybe in some cases can bear the brunt of feeding very poor quality silage to them. That's not the case, all right? They need at least a medium quality silage, and after calving they need very good quality silage, all right? Just looking at the feed values, and Daniel has some of these up, and that's barley on its own, dried barley. So the 1 kilogram of dry matter barley has a feed value with this. So your spring grass has this type of feed value of one unit, just over 1 unit, and autumn grass declines in feed value, all right, but still not low. You can see your silage then, typical silage is here with 64% TMD that we're seeing on farms, very typical silage, so you're dramatically lower. It doesn't seem like a lot, but this is 25% lower than this 1 unit, and considerably lower than a kilogram of barley, all right? And this is why performance is declined. In addition to that, if silage quality is poor, and there might be other reasons why silage quality is intake. So in addition to that, has poor quality, maybe there's poor intake characteristics, might be very wet, very stemmy, low protein, etc. And younger cattle, in particular light weanlings, may not be able to consume this poor quality silage. So while again, they may not be consuming what they're able to consume, should consume. And again, that all bears the brunt on the particularly lighter stock over the winter months. Poor quality silage, poor intake characteristics of the silage, and performance could be, in some cases, very, very poor. All right. So what we tend to see on farms, and 3 on-farm situations, and I probably covered some of this probably in my yearly, I did one of these presentations in spring, and it's online there on YouTube if anyone wants to look back on it. 3 scenarios we might see on farms where farmers don't supplement stock at all. And probably my opinion there that if you're not willing to feed the cattle adequately over the winter months, and if you look at the cost, you could, in reality, make more money by not having those cattle if you're not willing to feed them properly, all right? Then it's appropriate supplementation levels, and then very high supplementation levels. So I have questionable on the top one and a questionable on the last one, obviously, with meal prices today and beef prices. Obviously, high supplementation can be questionable as well. So dry matter intake there, and that's what the wean and probably generally intakes about 2% of its weight, maybe a bit more, 2% of its weight, and that's what it needs in terms of UFL. So you can go and multiply them back out yourself if you want to see what they're taking in, and why they don't seem that much short when you look at their intakes. All right, they don't seem that much short. What happens when you add the barley or whatever, the feed to it, the concentrate to it, you increase the overall energy density of the diet. So by feeding 2 kilograms extra of concentrate, for example, you are displacing some of the silage, So in reality, you're just buying something that you could have got out in the field if you've made better quality silage, all right? You're paying for the fact that you didn't make good enough quality silage day 1, all right? And that's just the weaners. I'll let you go through that yourself probably, and what they need in UFL and multiply it out there, okay? And similarly with the 18 to 20 months old cattle, all right? What they should be taking in UFL in terms per day to gain 0.6 per kilogram. And I say this is the target for stock probably on your farm, that you can half a kilogram to 0.6. It doesn't make a huge difference as long as you're not down as 0 to 0.3 of a kilogram per day, all right? This is the target if your stock are going back to grass again. If you're probably selling from sheds and weanings or stores and marts, you'll probably be going for a bit higher than this. Okay. And there's your suckler cows. Again, they have just a point on the suckler cow. Again, as I say, maybe the farmers tend to feed a lower quality silage to the cows, but just remember in the last 2 to 3 months, last 2 months prior to calving, the energy requirement of that cow goes up dramatically, all right? So where if you're feeding a very poor quality silage to a cow, she might go along grand, and then all of a sudden she hits the last 2 months prior to calving, her energy requirement increases dramatically, and you could see her body condition go back rapidly. So be awfully careful of feeding very poor quality silage to cows. It's not recommended, all right? And in that situation where it's very poor, you do need to supplement, you may need supplement, all right? And that's the calf cow and her energy requirements, okay? So just generally, and again, I look at this very simply, what we're seeing in a lot of farms is average quality silage, okay? And generally with average quality silage, you need to be feeding around 2 kilograms of meal per head per day, all right? And where you move up into 70, so farmers, any cattle farmer needs to be focusing on making silages up towards the 70 or above the 70 dry matter digestibility, all right? In that situation, you could nearly eliminate the meal on store cattle and considerably reduce it on weanlings, And this meal feeding level in a lighter weanling in particular needs to be higher. If you weanlings going in at 200 kilograms, 250, 150, whatever, they need to be consuming probably 3 kilograms of meal. And you can see the cost attached to that. It's not cheap, but if you put those animals in on average quality silage and keep them for the winter and don't feed them adequately, they'll do very poorly. And those tend to be the ones that are kept on farms. Obviously, the farmer's going to keep his lighter weanlings with the hope of them putting on a bit of weight, maybe hoping to get a better price in the spring. Opinion I'd have on probably keeping those lighter weanlings would be, by the time you add the costs of silage and meal, the only way it pays to keep them is that if you get a price increase going from the autumn to the spring. So you're dependent on a price increase to cover or provide profit in that situation. Otherwise, you're just covering your costs. In the situation where the weanling didn't thrive at all, well then it's probably a loss-making venture, all right? These are the meal feeding levels for finish, and I'll go through that a bit more. And farmers probably tend to, what you see in a lot of cases now, they're probably feeding nearly an ad lib diet. They're not dependent on the silage. They're probably realizing in a lot of situations that their silage isn't good enough. And maybe up until recent years, meal prices obviously weren't too bad. But when you're looking at 320 for rolled barley, and I think that was €100 a ton cheaper than that some years ago, feeding ad lib meals. Would probably be questionable, the economics of that as well. All right. Silage for your suckler cows, again on the 70 DMC silage, you have really good silage. Well, then you need to restrict that to dry cows. All right, you need to restrict that to dry cows. Obviously, to do that, you need to have adequate feed space. You can't have 8 or 9 cows in the slat pen. You need to have adequate feed space. Generally, on average, silage, provided the cow is in good condition, ad lib silage will do her. If the silage is in poor quality, that cow may need to get some meal, depending on her condition. But again, as I said, long-term feeding of poor quality silage to cows isn't really on, okay? Calf cows, again, in this situation there, and some farmers may be calving a few cows now this time of year. And again, this farmers are autumn calving, maybe what would you call October, November calving. In that situation, I'd always say that farmers should only do that where they're making top quality silage. Otherwise, the cost of it is too high, all right? If you're calving October, November, you need to go back in with meal until at least you get the cow back in calf. If you don't feed her adequate meal, she'll be very slow for you going back in calf, all right? And again, would say in December, January calf, and those cows don't tend to go to grass until probably March, early April. They're in the shed a good while. Those need to be meal fed a month after calving. They'll probably need to go on some meal, depending on silage quality. Again, I'll just say again, you can look at an average 2 kilos across a lot of stock. Weanland stores, calf cows, on average quality silage, 2 kilograms of meal. If the silage is poor, if the cow is milking that bit more, for example, she may need more, okay? And so on. So I kind of talked about that there. 10 cows as well may need additional meal feeding levels to this. 10 cows, cows carrying twins, and farmers are recommended. One of the big reasons you should be scanning probably a lot earlier than now, probably back last September or whatever, is to pick up probably twins in cows. And okay, every now and again we come across farmers who have a disaster with this. They haven't picked up cows that are calf to twins. The next thing, they have massive problems near calf. All right, cows in calf to twins need to be supplemented with some level of meal. In calf heifers, particularly if they're very young heifers and are following the protocol of calving at 2 years of age, those continue to thrive. I suppose farmers are kind of afraid to feed them. They should be getting a small bit of meal, again, depending on quality silage, probably a kilogram to 2. Again, watch conditions, they don't get too fat prior to calve, and maybe take that out maybe a month prior to calve and that bit of meal. But those heifers need to be thriving, as I probably mentioned, good milking cows after calve, and some cows obviously milk a lot better than others. some of those really good milking cows will need a bit more meal than the lower yielding cows. Okay, so indoor manage. Something I think farmers need to focus on here with meal feeding. So I would say most farmers kind of tend to feed a lot of meal now in the finishing period, and probably there's nothing wrong with that up until this year with the price of it. You need to focus on daily feed costs. All right, it's quite easily do. Like if you're feeding 7, 8, whatever you're feeding kilograms of meal to finish in stock, you know what it's costing you per day. You just need to be aware in that situation, I think, of carcass gain on stock, and farmers just aren't fully kind of up on this. So just say some stock might be gaining at 1.2 kilograms, depending on the breed. But when that kill out is that it's not when an animal is putting on its finishing kilograms, you do get a higher percentage of it as carcass, or depending on the animal. So, for example, there. Maybe traditional breeds, or maybe more towards Forage, these, they might put on 1.2 kilograms, maybe a bit more than that. Maybe only half of that has gone on as carcass, if you get what I'm saying. In the situation then in a good continental, all right, maybe it's gaining 1.6 kilos, for example. That animal could be putting on 1 kilogram of carcass per day. So you need to differentiate between those animals and realize what carcass gain you're getting. Now, I know it's not the easiest thing to do, but I suppose one way of doing this is regular weighing of stock. Maybe I know it's not the easiest job to do on farms is regularly weigh these stock, but probably you need to weigh them maybe 2 weeks after housing, maybe again, maybe 6 weeks time, see how they're performing and so on. And then obviously maybe again prior to slaughter and just see what sort of level of kill out you're getting. You'll get an idea probably of carcass gain, and you'll know yourself probably. All right. In addition to, again, you need to kind of focus on feed conversion, all right? Feed conversion. Some of these stock convert feed to beef a lot better than others. Again, a good example, probably some of these dairy cross stock could intake a power of meal, and they mightn't be putting on huge numbers of kilograms. And that could be as well as a Charolais type animal. It just depends on the breed. And this is where you probably should be using these famous indexes that some farmers aren't too fond of. And within some of those are kind of ratings on feed conversion, okay, and there's research on this particular bulls within Buff and Tully, how they convert, what bulls convert feed to beef better than others, and you need to be focusing on this going forward, and you should always be focusing on it really. Just focus there obviously on these, I would say dairy type, but some stock are putting on a lot more carcass than others, all right, and that's number one. And obviously some of these are doing it. So those two animals, for example, if there was a dairy cross, for example, or a beef cross, and I'm not trying to put down the dairy or one against the other by any means, just be aware of what carcass you're putting on in the end, and it could be the same feed that's going into each of these animals. All right, it could be. All right, prolonged finishing, just got to be careful as well with prolonged finishing. People that are good at feeding meal, and I'm not saying good, they're feeding adequate meals, that might, I think Daniel mentioned this. You sometimes see farmers pushing stock on, they're bouncing with flesh at the end. All right, so as an animal approaches finishing, it becomes less efficient as well in its feed conversion, because the animal, number one, is getting bigger, so it actually takes more feed to maintain. So let's just say the animal is 100 kilograms heavier than it was maybe 6 or 7 weeks ago, whatever. It's taken more energy just to maintain itself because it's a bigger animal. Number two, then, as an animal gets fat, it's less efficient putting on fat than muscle, all right? And fat weighs lighter. So there's no point having flesh bouncing off an animal, particularly with meal prices as they are. So obviously what people are focused on is grid and where they're finishing up on the grid, whatever, in terms of fat score, and obviously fat score is very important, but you don't want to be going up paying to get excessive fat, particularly say when feed conversion is probably declining near the end. What you're feeding, you need to feed more just to maintain the animal. The animal's what's putting on actually its gain is less. So we might be gaining 1.5 kilograms at the start of the finishing period. In the first number of weeks, 5 or 6 weeks, it may be gaining a lot less in the last 3 or 4 weeks. And Daniel highlighted this as well. So again, it's very important just to watch that. And farmers probably tend to focus on final slaughter price. All right. Just remember, it might have cost you a lot to get that extra €100 at the end. All right. So appropriate fat score, just mentioned that there. Okay. So analyze, I think Daniel kind of covers some of this, but farmers should get into analyzing silage on a yearly basis, and use those silage tests to supplement appropriately. Again, the silage test, I think, should be used to analyze kind of where you went wrong or maybe what you done right in making the silage. It'll give you a good indication. Where did I make a mistake, maybe, or what did I do right to get such good silage, And like silage quality probably should be getting better every year in farms. Probably what we've seen in the last 10 or 20 years is probably getting worse in a lot of cases, or in some cases. But with meal prices the way they are and so on, and margins so low, farmers are kind of focused on this a bit better, right? So use your silage quality. Some farmers would do a silage test. They won't feed any more meals because they'll just think it's so expensive. But use that silage test to see where can I go, what can I do better to make better quality silage next year. You know what I mean? So it's just your own feed, and better quality silage is cheaper per unit energy than poor quality silage. All right, the only place where you can feed average to poor quality silage on farms is dry cows for a number of months after housing. All right. So how do you make good quality silage? Well, you need to be cutting young grass, good quality grass, young grass, obviously adequate fertilizer, and obviously weather plays a big part in this as well. And just a point there as well, we come across it myself maybe in the last few weeks, silage quality and preservation. You can have good quality silage that has preserved poorly, all right, for particular reasons. Maybe it's a bit of nitrogen left in the silage, maybe the silage was made in poor weather conditions, and drying as well. I think you can over dry your silage. Sometimes farmers think that by drying their silage so massively, it's a good thing. It can be a bad thing because that silage can tend to heat more so on opening of pits and bales, all right? So over drying your silage can be a bad thing. I think the feeling out there is that you should dry your silage very well, all right? And that's not the case. Once you get to 25-30% dry matter, 35-30% dry matter, that's adequate. Going into high dry matter silage, 35-40% isn't advisable for a number of reasons. Other considerations in shed, and we talked about quality silage, but you need a good clean water supply. Clean out your troughs regularly, make sure they're not full of dung or dirt, whatever. Stock have access to that. There's no plenty of space to get in and drink. Feed space and lying space, also important. Ventilation. A lot of sheds are very warm, all right, and obviously that was kind of apparent probably in the last couple of weeks there where the weather's been quite good. Just be careful with ventilation as well. Partly farmers in warm sheds are leaving doors open and things like that, just that you're not putting a draft on stock as well, just to think of yourself, like if you don't like the door open and a draft blowing in top of yourself. It's the same with cattle, all right? So where you're leaving doors open, you might need to block off at a lower level to prevent drafts in and stock line and pens and so on, okay? Dosing is also another issue. I think that's been covered on one of our webinars in probably 2 weeks' time, and I advise you to tune into that. I suspect in some farms, dosing of stock is not up to scratch, and this is one of the reasons as well. Stock in some situations are performing very poorly. So the summary there, optimize cattle performance over the winter. As I said, it's very expensive. You don't want a situation where cattle are going into shed and thriving. As I say, it's probably more profitable to leave that shed empty, believe it or not. And quality silage is massively important, all right? Do your silage analysis, as I mentioned. And sometimes I have a kind of something I just say at the back of my head, I might say to my own farmers in groups, and that maybe you should only winter cattle that you're going to let to grass again yourself, all right? You should only probably winter cattle. This is probably a bit harsh, but when you look at the costs of it, and I just look at the shed as a paddock, all right? So you move your cattle around the field, all right? You move your cattle around the field, around the farm, sorry. You're moving them from paddock to paddock. Unfortunately, you have to put them into this paddock for 4 to 5 months. Some farmers, no matter what, they want to leave them in there 6 months. I don't know why that is. But it's a very expensive paddock, all right? And the stock ain't performing in there in a lot of situations. And even if they're performing, they're still performing, even when they're performing as to the optimum at 0.6 or 0.5 kilogram per day, that's a very expensive thrive. So farmers in general, obviously, maybe we're dealing with here in this part of Mayo, maybe I know there's all different farmers, but suckler farmers, some of the stock they keep are those lighter weanlings. And those lighter weanlings, as I say, for lots of reasons, they don't perform well. in my opinion, those all stock that are kept over the winter and you intend to sell them, you should probably let them to grass for 4 to 6 weeks. The thrive you get here in this 4 to 6 weeks is massive. The cattle will clean up. So in addition to this, like you're marketing your stock well, like, you know, I see farmers there selling in calf heifers over the last few weeks, and the effort put into put them shining and clip them and everything. And then you get farmers running out of cattle, out of sheds that are poorly fed, go down to Baldon and expecting a good price for them. So one of the advantages here is maybe letting them to grass for 4 to 6 weeks, these cattle that are maybe light weanings, whatever, as opposed to selling them out of the shed. You're diluting the costs as well, you know, so you're not spending a good bit of money feeding those stock over the winter. By letting them to grass for 4 to 6 weeks, you're considerably diluting the cost of the period, all right, from this October onwards, whatever, until when you sell them next April or May. And the target will be to get those weanings to grass from early March onwards, whenever the weather picks up in late February. Now, I know some farmers will think this is crazy, but some farmers would have tried this and they find it massive that those stock will turn inside out in 4 to 6 weeks. They're different animals, you wouldn't recognize them, all right? And they say that your stock, and it's up to you to market them as good as possible and get as much out of them as possible. And the advantage here, you dilute the costs, you're getting a bit of very cheap gain on them for that period. And I say the harsh reality of it, in my opinion, is stock shouldn't be wintered on farms unless they're going to grass. And some wise people there won't buy cattle now, obviously. They'll hold off buying until later on, you know, until the winter's over and someone else has bore the cost for them. Okay.
That's perfect, Austin. Look at you.
I'm going a bit long there. Sorry, Brendan. Yeah.
No, you're okay. That's
45 minutes. Just give me 2 more minutes, Brendan. Yeah. So just watch your cow body condition prior to and after calving, all right? Prior to and after calving. Obviously, if a cow's very thin, they need a bit of supplementation even prior to calving and after calving. I say if cows in the shed a month after calving, they need to be getting supplemented as well. Okay, I think that's it, Brendan. Thank you.
That's perfect, Austin. Look, thanks very much there now for that, Austin. I'll just let you stop sharing your presentation and you can stay with us, Austin, because we'll go now to Vivian Silke there, the regional manager there, who's going to put your questions there to Austin and Daniel. So I'm just going to ask Daniel to come back in there and Vivian as well there, just to host and facilitate the questions and answers there. So there's a good lot of questions coming in there, folks. So I suppose, look, there's still time there to put your questions there to our panelists there. You know, I suppose, look, we've lots of questions there that's come in there, and Vivian is just now going to take the questions that you've put there, our panelists. So over to you now, Vivian.
Thanks, Brendan. Thanks to everyone for joining the webinar tonight. Just before I go into the questions, the beef conference, National Beef Conference, which Teagasc normally run this time of the year, was held 2 years ago in Claremorris and McWilliam. Unfortunately, this year due to COVID, we can't have it, but we're having 2 nights next week, similar to tonight, 2 nights of focused beef topics on the National Beef Conference. So they're on Monday night next week at 8 o'clock and also Wednesday night. So locally we're taking a break. This is our second webinar so far this winter. So next week it's going to the National Beef Conference Monday night and Wednesday night. You can tune in through the local Teagasc website. And we're back in again ourselves on Wednesday the 15th, which is Wednesday week, where we have Tom Kelly from Teagasc and Ballinrobe and also Derek McLaughlin from the Wild Connected Nature Project. We'll be talking about new schemes on the coast and also the environmental work that's ahead of us all. Now, after that, I'll go into the questions, so just bear with me now 1 sec. Okay, the first question, Daniel, I'll go to you. And there's 2 questions here, one after another, which you can deal with. So it's a question from a viewer. Is the bolus good enough for getting minerals into cows pre-calving, or would you go with the daily requirement?
If you've been using them up to now and you've had no problems, I continue to use them. It depends a little bit on when they have been administered. So maybe if cows came in September, October, you got them then. Maybe calving is March into April. They may be starting to have sort of run out of power, if you like, at that stage. But if you haven't been having any problems up to now, if it's not broken, why try and fix it?
Okay. And also, Daniel, for yourself, how much is the silage testing? How much does it cost?
With us, for customers, it's a free service to help them plan out their winter nutrition.
Okay, that's good to know. Okay, and another question, possibly either for yourself or Austin, whichever one of you maybe wants to handle it. It's a question we commonly get asked. Is a pit better for making quality silage or bales?
Leave that to you, Daniel, all right? Pass. Do you want to go with that one, Daniel, do you?
Yeah, sure. It depends, I suppose. Just looking today at the testing so far this year, actually, there wasn't a whole lot of difference between the averages for the pit samples and the bale samples. I suppose bales provide maybe a little bit more flexibility. So if a paddock does go strong, a bit too strong for grazing, you can take that out. It improves your grass quality, and you do get very good quality silage there then to offer to those weanlings or finishing cattle that Austin was talking about. So it really depends, I suppose, on the size, the scale, and so on.
Okay, that's a good question, especially for you, Austin. A viewer here is keeping weanling bulls for the winter, so is feeding them now at the moment. Plans to sell them in late January, February. The question is, should he castrate them now or keep them as bulls for the springtime?
Yeah, that's a good one. That's asking me to predict the market going forward, which I probably cannot do. Depends. Yeah. So, geez, I couldn't answer that one clearly, Vivian. What would you get? Would you have an opinion on that one yourself, Vivian? Would you?
Depending on the weight of the muscle, I suppose. If they're hovering around 300 kilos, which you mentioned, as a good weaning weight for a 6-7 month old weanling. If they were mine, I'd probably castrate them and have them ready for grass buyers in February, March. If they're very high quality and very shapy and maybe U-grade pluses, that might be going for the shipping market, it might be better to leave them entire. It all depends on the quality of the animal. Might
exactly. Yeah. So I mean, obviously, so those obviously, and I suppose the suckler cow numbers are declining, maybe not as dramatically as they're reflected in media. There is a demand always for quality cattle in the spring. I did make a comment about selling in late January. Yeah. So 2 kilograms probably wouldn't be adequate for them, depending on silage quality. You'd need to be pushing them on. So those cattle being sold out of sheds probably should be on, depending on silage quality, probably 2 to 3 kilos minimum, maybe more again. All right. Would you agree with that, Daniel, yourself?
Yeah. I suppose silage test important there. See the quality of that. Then I think, as Vivian alluded to there, maybe, and yourself, maybe consider your markets, bit of cost on it, and make your decision based on that, I think.
Yeah, so those need to be probably gaining probably up to a kilogram or more. Those ones really should be so I talked about the 0.6, and I probably should have highlighted this maybe in my presentation a bit more. When we're talking about a half kilogram to 0.6, we're assuming that probably your cattle are going back to grass on that farm, all right? They're going back to grass on that farm, and cattle do compensatory growth once they get to spring. So, and Teagasc research shows that if you feed 3 to 4 kilograms to a weaning over the winter, and it goes to grass, the one that's fed maybe the 2 kilograms for winter, it'll catch back up by June or July. It'll catch back up to it. The only reason someone like that asked that question would be feeding high levels to go into the mart. They want to get a higher price. They want a heavier weaning, all right? And obviously for the fella buying them maybe and putting them to grass, well, there's probably less scope for thrive in them, just to make you aware of that, because the scope for compensatory growth isn't there on them because they've shoved to their potential in the previous 3 months, all right?
Just something that comes to mind there, Austin, as you were talking in terms of the castration for that question. If they are to be castrated, farmers need to be mindful that once they're over 6 months of age, they need to involve a veterinary surgeon in that process. So just be aware of that from an welfare point of view, and we want to be conscious of that for going forward, and from the consumer's point of view as well. A related question again, Austin, where a farmer has average quality silage, would you feed the same level of meal throughout the whole winter, or would you feed higher at the start to help the weaning process and help the settlement of the shed?
Yeah, you'd probably you'd probably front load that meal again. Yeah, front load it probably again, depending on the weight of the weaning at this stage, and probably, as I say, on those lighter weanings, they need to be going up to 3 kilograms. All right, now again, all this is provided they're going back to grass, maybe on your farm. They need to be going up to 3 kilograms. You could probably ease off on that if you know you're getting to grass in early March. And that's the aim, and I know it's probably difficult for a lot of farmers to think of that, but that should be ingrained in every farmer's plans. You're not going to get the 200 kilograms I talked about unless you get back to grass in that period. And again, farmers are getting in it. Lots of farmers haven't that many weanings. 10 weanings aren't too hard to get to grass on a lot of farms. But I would front load the feed, particularly with those lighter weanings, all right, and so on, all right.
Okay, there's a question here on dosing, which I'm going to leave for the moment until, as you said, Austin, 2 weeks' time. We have an outside expert handling those questions. So hopefully that viewer can tune in at that stage. Another question, Daniel, for yourself. At current costs, which is better value, barley or maize, in terms of maybe formulating a straight ration?
On a unit of energy, maize would be. If it's a finishing,
it's a finishing question. Yeah, sorry,
I'd push for the maize there, anyways, for the higher energy, and it tends to give higher fat cover, and it's slightly safer as well for feeding at higher levels. So I'd go for maize there.
Okay. I just have some other questions here now. Just bear with me for a moment. Another question, Daniel. It's probably related to pre-calving, I'd imagine. Is oats a good feed for cows before they calve?
Yeah, some interest in that actually this year. If it's a finishing ration, then no, probably not, because the energy isn't as high. But it's quite good in, we'll say, a general kind of a ration for store animals, even waylands at slightly lower amounts. The fibre is slightly higher in it as well, so it's a safe feed.
And this listener had some issues with calves not being that lively and retaining cleanings after cows calved. What do we need to consider if that's an ongoing issue over the winter in terms of maybe especially equipped pre-calf minerals or something we need to look at for that?
Yeah, potentially. So if I suppose if pre-calf minerals aren't been given up to now, then certainly they should be given from now on. If they are and you're still having that issue, probably need to look at taking a silage sample, having that analysed, and that will give a better indication then of if some particular minerals are very low, and you might need a slightly higher spec pre-calf mineral there in that case.
Okay, just go back to you, Austin. You mentioned a lot about silage quality, and it's critical on farms. When should first cut silage be harvested?
Sounds, yeah. So I think farmers probably should be aiming to cut silage from the 20th of May onwards. All right, now this is probably on the better grounds, so that'll be closed and have it closed by the 10th of April, depending on whenever you get a good chance there in early April, fields should be closed and fertilised, and aim to cut from the 20th of May onwards. All right, to get the quality in silage. Now you can make good quality silage right through the summer, but obviously you probably need pre-seeded grounds for that, which are second cut, whatever. But to aim to get the real good quality, I'd be aiming for 20th of May onwards. And it's a big change for farmers, but it's something that needs to be considered on lots of cattle farms. And obviously, sometimes as well, that time of year it might be easier to get a contractor. He's not kind of in the throngs of maybe everyone wants to cut the silage in late June after the 15th of June. And I'm saying they're not that. Next thing we'll have them all busy at that period as well. But I suspect it's easy to get contractors around that time to make their silage, because maybe not too many farmers are making it around that time. But obviously, what's your dairy farmer, what's your neighbour, whatever, he's making his silage at that period, all right, because he knows the value of it in his milk tank, all right.
Okay, and in light of recent price explosions in fertilizer costs, Austin, would that advice remain the same?
Yeah, I suppose advice out there, yeah, on lower stock farms, and probably what will happen maybe next year is maybe very little fertilizer will go if prices remain as predicted or as now. Probably there'll be considerably reduced fertilizer levels on pasture grounds anyway. As silage, you cannot really be skimping on fertilizer or silage, you know. What and I suppose even farmers do always think that fertilizer is very expensive. Probably the problem with fertilizer up until now, and this is probably fairly dramatic, it was fairly cheap, right? And we couldn't get fellas to buy it. Fertilizer is cheap when you compare it to the price of meal, or you compare it to the price of poor quality silage, for example. Not cheap now, but I'm saying in the past, all right? But it's something you cannot skimp on, and maybe farmers in the past were skimping, that reducing their fertilizer applications, letting the grass grow longer to make up for let it bulk up, and all you're doing in that situation is you're diluting your energy. And as I said earlier on, poor quality silage per unit of energy is way more expensive, a way more expensive feed, so it's only a false economy, all right? So we would be recommending as well to continue with your silage, obviously get your slurry out as well, very important. Get the slurry out there late March and get the nitrogen out of it. Use probably low emission slurry spreading equipment. You'll get a bit more nitrogen out of the slurry in that situation, and you might be able to reduce your nitrogen a small amount, but not considerably, all right? All right.
So that I'll hand back to Brendan. We're just coming up to closing time.
Thanks very much there, Vivian. Indeed, look, we're just about out of time. I'd like to thank our two panellists here this evening, Austin Callaghan, their local Teagasc advisor in Claremorris, and indeed Daniel Hession, our guest speaker there tonight from Aurivo Mills, based in Ballahadreen. And thank you very much there to Daniel and Austin. And of course, thanks to Vivian there for hosting and facilitating the questions and answers. But most importantly, look, thanks to you tonight for staying with us, engaging with us here on this webinar. We hope you found the webinar beneficial and useful on your farm, and we'll be getting the recording uploaded to the Teagasc Mayo YouTube channel in the coming days. All that's left for me to say, as Vivian said, is that we will be taking a short break next week due to the virtual beef conference, which is on Monday and Wednesday night. And indeed, we will be back here again on Wednesday, the 15th of December, where, as Vivian said, we'll be looking at the current and, I suppose, future agri-environmental schemes, how they might be shaped, with Tom Kelly there, our advisor in Ballina, and Derek McLaughlin there from the Wild Atlantic Nature Project. So indeed, it's a good night from us all here in County Mayo here tonight, and indeed, stay safe, folks. Thank you very much.